When I heard about the title for today's service, Swords into Plowshares, my mind rushed in multiple directions. First, I thought about a wooden leg that used to live in my grandmother's attic. It's a tall leg that dates back to the Civil War, belonging to some long ago relative. But for me, it's always been a reminder, a visual reminder of the cost of war. Then I thought about a trip that I'm taking this summer, going back to Bosnia, to sing and to pay witness to their peace-building efforts. The music camp I'm going to is hosted locally by the Center for Peacebuilding in Sanski Most. And the work they do isn't easy. It involves many conversations with many cups of coffee. For me, this area of the world has become more than just a news story. In the headlines and then not. It's become real, and people that I know and care about, and I wish them well in their journey. Finally, for a chalice lighting, I thought of the words by Lao Tse. If there's to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there's to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there's to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there's to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart.
So there was an argument, and tensions and frustrations and angers were flying all over the room. And after the initial argument ended and tensions were at their highest, the first person decided they needed to take the dog for a walk. And with every step and every dog sniff on the boulevard and each passing car, a new, stronger part of the rebuttal was being formed. Reasons why they were right and the second person was wrong, a rebuttal that addressed the concerns and points raised in the argument, and one that yet did not back down or show any weakness. The courage to speak truth to this was stronger with each step, and as the leash was hung on the door, and the dog and the human re-entered the house, just at the moment that this epic, foolproof rebuttal was to begin, the second person looked up and simply said, "I'm sorry." Oh, but it was such a good rebuttal. This unexpected twist, in an instant, in a mix of disappointment, the sense of deflation, it would now be unseemly to rebut. Replied the first person, after working so hard on this argument, having spent no time considering apologies at all, or any type of weakness, or maybe in a different word, humility or vulnerability. The rebuttal was rendered useless, and the attack was disarmed, and while the conversation was continued and the tension was still real, diplomacy won the day as they lay down their swords and shields. I know that nothing like this has ever happened to any of you. I know nothing like this has ever happened to me. Worked to prepare a perfect rebuttal, planned the right words that would speak the truth with just a little sting, only to be met by mercy and grace and compassion that made you melt, and the conversation unclenched, and while not easy, was no longer explosive. I know that that still happens in the world, even if much of the evidence we see each day says it all ends in violence. I know that this can still happen when people notice the humanity of the other, even amid differences and disagreements, and listen to the depth of pain or a different experience other than one's own. It can open a person up. It can open you up to a different vantage point, open you up to disparities in power or history or access or privilege, open you up to the reality that sometimes they aren't just policy differences or political stripe, party lines, they are real lived human experiences that you must pay attention to. And the question of morality, the question of any good part of religion, asks to pay attention to the humanity beyond the talking points, the experience and lived reality beyond the party lines. How do we imagine something that is so far beyond what we hear in the news every day, so far beyond what we experience in our politics every day? How do we imagine something beyond messages on Memorial Day or other times around nationalism and militarism and a surface-level patriotism? How do we begin to imagine a more peaceful world when swords are turned into plowshares and Memorial Day at its best can honor less and less people because we've lost less lives to war? How do we imagine that world? Often we turn to poets to lead us. Denise Levertov writes, "The poets must give us imagination of peace, to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster. But peace," she writes, "like a poem, is not there ahead of itself. It can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known except in the words of its making, grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid, a feeling towards it. Dimly sensing a rhythm is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. A line of peace," she writes, "must appear if we restructured the sentence our lives are making. If we revoked its affirmation of profit or power, questioned our needs, and allowed long pauses. A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum, a peace, a presence, an energy field that's more intense than war, might pulse then, stanza by stanza into the world, each act of living one of its words, and each word a vibration of light." She asks, what if we restructured the sentence our lives are making? There is something about national identity, something about pride and patriotism that can quickly slip into something that looks more like totalitarianism, quickly turns into rote expectation, that to show allegiance or to be a patriot is to never dissent, but always to support, without question, a government or a nation, to stand for its anthem, to pledge allegiance to its flag, a pledge where we have inserted into something that by some religions is considered idolatry, worshiping a flag or a nation, we've inserted, but not until the 1950s, a God and a religious tradition into the pledge itself that railed against idolatry. Putting God into a national pledge requiring children to say it might be neither patriotism nor faith, but in both might be leading towards totalitarianism and religious blasphemy. All of the sudden, sometimes, we take these soft images in our wider culture, this surface-level patriotism, and we make policies requiring NFL players, the majority of whom are African Americans, to stand for the national anthem or to hide in the locker room, to show deference to a nation that enslaved their ancestors and obliterated their cultural heritage, that wrote into its constitution that their forebears were 3/5 of a human being, and that up until not long ago were not allowed to drink the same water, eat at the same counter, learn in the same classrooms as whites. It's a disturbingly bizarre policy, with echoes of African Americans being told by their white owners to get up from lunch counters, from bus seats, from cotton fields. They are paid so much, though, the response is. They choose to do this work. But choosing a profession does not justify nationalistic subjugation, ever. Kneeling is an ancient form of prayer and humility, an act of reverence and strength, and it's seen in a country that often lacks humility as disrespectful. This is not normal. Our politics are not normal. Ours is a country that could use a little humility, of laying low to the ground, kneeling even, so that when we feel and hear and pay attention to the stories that often go unnoticed, the oppressions that often go ignored, hearts could be opened. With policies in Minnesota that are proposing now to increase major penalties for blocking transit as a form of protest, or a president questioning if people who protest should even remain in the country, how are we forgetting so much of our history? That protest is, in fact, as much or more than baseball, a national pastime, a hallmark of free speech to guard against totalitarian regime. Public spaces, and the equivalent being the public square, which has shifted in our modern culture of where that is exactly, have always been the place where protest and social change happens, on roadways, in restaurants, in schools, on streets. Protest can be one of the most patriotic things a person can do. To believe in the possibility of change and progress, to believe enough in this country, to care enough for its people, to hold it to its highest principles and best possibilities by being honest about our history, to be humble in our pride, so that nationalistic fervor does not get in the way of our moral progress. Such rote patriotism leads to brokenness and the grief of Memorial Day. It leads to unquestioned violence and war, and building walls and false sense of ownership of this land. It leads to dehumanization of immigrants and undocumented people. It throws people into both the moral chaos and the physical harm of war, and the remnants of what war means for soldiers and families, for communities and countries, for hearts and bodies and souls. My brother is a captain in the U.S. Army. He serves at Fort Bragg, and a few times throughout the year he's deployed with special forces. And part of that service means that his family is not allowed to know where he is. Not just me as a brother or my parents, but his own wife and children sit in waiting while he's gone somewhere in the world. It puts families in this tense, anxious place, not knowing what will happen. That's the cost of this type of nationalistic fervor can lead to. This place of uncertainty and anxiety, even if one chooses it and moves into it willingly, it has effects that ripple out. After every war, someone has to clean up, writes the poet. Things don't straighten themselves up. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes. Someone must glaze a window and rehang a door. Photogenic, it's not, and it takes years. All the cameras have left for another war, but bridges need to come back. We need new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls how it was. To imagine peace, we must know our past, to learn from it, to grapple with it, to confront it, so that we can confront the unknown ways that we perpetuate war or violence or anger or fear globally and locally, which begins as anger or fear in the heart. That step by step grows. Each step crafting the rebuttal, the counterattack, returning violence with violence, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. But we know there are other ways, better courses. There is more love and grace and peace that begins in homes and in hearts and in face-to-face conversation. We need every layer of peace we can find until it's thick enough, strong enough to hold us. So looking at my backyard this spring, the 2 days of spring we had, so now into this early summer, I've wondered how ferns have survived for millennia in such abundance in certain places, including my yard. And I thought maybe it had to do with the root system, some communal aspect of connection or solidarity, which may have a little bit to do with it. But mostly it comes down to one thing, which many of you probably know, you green thumbs, two things kind of, change, adaptation, and shade. Various species have been around, but only through adaptation since the time of dinosaurs. Somewhere along the line, when they started being shaded out by the larger broadleaf plants, somehow they gained a gene from a neighboring plant. They knocked on the neighbor's door to get a gene instead of a cup of sugar. Ferns were able to soak in then and gain nourishment from two kinds of light, red and blue, compared to many plants which can only do this with one type of light. So with two kinds of light, they were able to lay low. They were able to stay close to the ground, these humble little prosperous plants, and thrive there. To survive, they had to change. Not just a habit or a practice, which is hard enough in human terms. They needed to change their chemistry. They needed to change their core, something much deeper than habit or practice. How they reacted to and with their world around them, they had to change how they gained nourishment. Instead of being shaded out by the plants that were changing and growing larger and taller and bigger, they adapted in humility and in brilliance to thrive and flourish for millennia. To kneel on a sideline, in prayer, in protest on a transit line, is an act of humility and power both at once. It grounds us, provides a place of integrity and intentionality from which our values and our actions come. To kneel in some type of practice for spiritual growth or for social change or working in a garden is reminding us to keep our identity, our pride, our devotion humble enough to keep us connected and close to the ground level of life. To attend to the stories and the people who have been trampled on there. To attend to the earth which is trampled on, to get down into the sacred dust and dirt of the world, and there be open to change and adaptation, transformation of the soul and of the society. If we lay down our sword and shield and turn our swords into plowshares, so that our energy is not put into weaponry, but into the hard work of tilling the ground beneath our feet, preparing the very land we inhabit for growth and for flourishing, and for possibility, we can survive for millennia. This past week, maybe some of you saw that across the country, religious leaders from many traditions engaged in direct action in what's called the Renewed Poor People's Campaign in honor of Reverend Dr. King, and renewed now by Reverend Dr. William Barber out of North Carolina. Locally, colleagues and justice workers in the Twin Cities have held rallies, blocked transit lines near the detention center where undocumented people were deported. And in a letter to the editor in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the leaders of Minnesota's local movement wrote, "Make no mistake, we are people of faith and we are loyal Americans. And our campaign is both deeply religious and profoundly patriotic. Every major religious tradition," they write, "places challenging oppression and criticizing systems of injustice at the center of our moral considerations. Furthermore, the preamble of our U.S. Constitution articulates foundational goals of establishing justice and promoting the general welfare for we the people, no exceptions. Our proudest moments," they write, "in our nation's history resulted from our better angels trying to live up to these principles and build a more equitable economy and society." So they sat on the ground, some of my colleagues, in humble, prophetic, patriotic strength, in protest and in prayer, right there on the transit line, demanding our nation live up to its values. Martin Luther King, in direct action and protest during the civil rights era, would often gather people and kneel in prayer to remind them and to remind those waiting for them with billy clubs and dogs that theirs was a prayerful, humble, reverent movement for a more just and beautiful world. It was also a reminder that they needed each other, that they were connected to something larger than for themselves. For some, it was their God. For some, it was community. For some, it was a justice and a future yet to be. For many, it was all those things mixed together and others yet to be named. And at the end of many of their gatherings, they would sing, "Precious Lord, take my hand," as a reminder to each of them that the work was wearisome and it was difficult, that they needed help beyond themselves, however they defined that. That through the storm and through the night, and to life's very end there was light, there was something, some call to love, still leading through the mess of it all. When the work of justice and of building up the world is done with humility, it reminds us we need each other. It reminds us that the work is tiresome and weary, that we need each other in some larger vision to hold us, to take us by the hand, to lead us forward to the change we need to consider, to the work that seems too hard, to the long haul of transformation. We need something, someone to help us turn our swords into plows, turn this earth back into the rich, life-giving soil that is a place so sacred to us, so grounding to us, that our deepest moral convictions and our loudest, angriest protests call us to kneel in humility and in power, to take the sword in our hand and turn it into the hard ground of war, to till it up into the hopeful possibility and soil and land of peace. Our closing hymn is Precious Lord. I invite you to rise in body or spirit, or sit down in protest. I invite you, as you're comfortable, to grab a hand next to you. The cost of violence is too great. The toll of it on communities and people, the toll of it on hearts and hope and possibility is too much to bear alone. So as we're working for a more peaceful world, grab some hand, whatever it is, to hold you through the night. May it be so. Amen.